Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Mayor Room in the Lockheed Center for another Lunch and Learn event, a joint event between the Augustana Alumni Office and the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life. My name is Ian Wilson. I'm director of the Ronning Center and also an assistant professor of religious studies here. We've done a number of these joint events between our center and the alumni office, and it's always a pleasure. I'd like to thank from the alumni office Trina and Sydney, who welcomed you outside, and also, of course, thank Diane from the Ronning Center. The three of them are instrumental in making these events happen and do a lot of work behind the scenes for setting this all up for you, our guests. So today we have we get to learn from, at this Lunch and Learn, from Dr. Katharine Batlan. Katharine is the postdoctoral fellow for the International Fellows Program at the Chester Ronning Center. She's our first postdoctoral fellow in this program. And we are thrilled to have her here at Augustana for a couple of years. She was educated at Texas Christian University, also at Harvard University, where she received her master's degree, and then at the University of Texas at Austin, where she did her doctoral work. Today, she is going to be presenting some of her doctoral research, which was on the history of amendment attempts to the U.S. Constitution, but I'll let her tell you all about that. This work will also form the basis of her first book project. She also just recently had an article accepted in the Journal of Church and State, which is a top-tier journal in her field. Her research expertise, if you haven't been able to tell from those little tidbits of information, is religion and law. So she's a historian of the law in North America and how that relates to religious communities. And she's also a scholar of religion generally. So here at Augustana, she's working on this research, continuing this research. She is organizing a major international conference for us, which will take place in April, and there will be a number of public events tied to that conference, so stay tuned. For specific details about all that, we're wrapping up those details right now. And she's also teaching here at Augustana, so there's some students here today who may be in her class, and if you're not, then you should be in her classes next year. So a little plug for Katharine and her courses here at Augustana. I will, hopefully you all got food. There's food there for those who have registered. Enjoy, and please welcome Katharine.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you also to the Ronning Center and Diane, the University of Alberta Augustana campus for bringing me here for this couple of years as a postdoctoral fellow. Thanks to Trina and the entire alumni office for putting on this Lunch and Learn. Thank you all for coming. This is a great group of people. I also need to thank the University of Texas at Austin for funding much of the research that went into this presentation. My husband Jim for his support, way to show up. And then some of the places where I got my research information from, including the U.S. National Archives, congressional records, in particular Adam Behrenbeck, the Center for Jewish History, the Reformed Presbyterian Archives, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary Library, University of Notre Dame Archives, Harvard Divinity School's Andover Library, the University of Texas at Austin's Dolph Briscoe Center for American History, and the UVO Institute for Jewish Research Archives. I also want to thank my father, Bob Batlan, who was an unpaid research assistant on 2 trips to the U.S. National Archives, and will be, I'm sure, watching this presentation later when it goes up on YouTube, so hi family. Okay, after all of that, let's get started on my presentation. While in the phrase, "In God we trust," can be found on U.S. currency, the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance includes the phrase, "under God," and the U.S. Supreme Court begins daily with the call, "God save the United States and this honorable court." The United States Constitution is godless. It includes no mention of God or a deity of any sort, but not everyone wanted it that way. Today I'll be talking about some of those people. The movement for a religious amendment but I tend to call it a Christian amendment for reasons that will become clear, was started by Covenanters, a small sect noteworthy for their long-standing abolitionism, objection to hymns other than psalms, and in the 19th century, they were known for conscientious objection from voting and serving on juries because of the lack of an acknowledgement of government power coming from God in the Constitution. These Covenanters thought that the US Constitution's godlessness was an open statement of rebellion against God's authority. Instead, they claimed the "We the People" statement beginning the Constitution's preamble wrested the law from God's authority and gave it improperly to the people. As Trinitarian Christians, people who see God as having three parts, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, they wanted the Constitution to include Jesus specifically, so there wouldn't be any concern of confusion. Though Covenanters saw some distinctions between church and state, they saw that God's power was over the state and didn't see any problem with enforcing Christian morality and principles upon the entire population. Instead, they wanted to harken back to the 1630s and 40s when Scotland was run by Presbyterians over much of the running of the government. Today, I'm going to start by discussing the US Constitution and how it can be amended. Then I'll mention some of their early efforts because even though I'm focusing on the 1940s and 50s today, they tried many times. And then I will get into the heart of the fight in the 1940s and 50s that showed that they are really pushing the envelope of what is acceptable in public for religion in the United States. Finally, I'll take a look at their opponents and how the US Supreme Court was also simultaneously moving away from supporting Protestant Christian public activities. Okay, so as I said, the US Constitution is godless. The original constitutional text ratified in 1789 only mentions religion in Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for federal office. As part of the original 10 amendments to the Constitution, religion shows up again in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, for a fun fact, if you want to impress people at parties like I do sometimes, was actually proposed third, but was ratified with the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, in 1791. It prohibits Congress from passing laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The First Amendment, it should be noted, only applied to the federal government. States only Congress is prohibited from passing such laws, and it was originally designed to restrict only the federal government. States could determine rights for their citizens and did so in varying ways. At the time of ratification, several states enshrined established churches, and Massachusetts was the last state to abolish its religious establishment in 1833. When the US Constitution's religion clauses were incorporated or applied to the states in the 1940s, it marked a big shift in the way religious liberty worked in the US. Though many states had their own bills of rights and their state constitutions, they were worded differently, and their state courts dealt with them in varying ways. If you'd like to know more about that, feel free to ask. That's another pet project of mine. According to Article 5 of the US Constitution, amendments can be made in two ways. It can first begin as a bill in Congress. 2/3 of both houses must approve the bill for it to move on to the next step. If, in the off chance, it does make it through Congress, as there have been over 11,000 proposed constitutional amendments to date, then states have to call their own constitutional conventions or their legislatures convene to determine whether to ratify the amendment or not. If 3/4 of the states choose to ratify the amendment, it is added to the Constitution. The First Amendment was what was attempted with Christian amendments, but there is another method that begins with a proposed amendment with state constitutional conventions calling for the amendment. Then once 3/4 of the states choose to ratify the amendment, the Constitution can be changed. Of the 11,000 proposed amendments throughout American history, Congress has adopted only 33 to send to the states, Of those, 26 were ratified, including the first 10 in 1789 that make up the Bill of Rights. The second method, where the amendment begins in state conventions, has only been used once for the 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition in 1933. This means that of the 11,000 proposed amendments to the US Constitution, only 27 have been ratified. Christian amendments failed, but they were in good company. Christian amendment advocates had written George Washington stating that the US Constitution lacked, quote, some explicit acknowledgement of the only true God and Jesus Christ who he hath sent. But it wasn't taken any further and nothing came from this early effort. Covenanters, however, didn't forget about this. Instead, they discussed the issue and bemoaned it among themselves as the original sin of the United States. They published about it frequently, gave sermons on the issue, and wrote about it in correspondence. But they didn't agitate for an amendment on a national stage throughout the first half of the 19th century, until the Civil War began. After the Civil War began, Covenanters met with President Lincoln in 1862 to urge him to abolish slavery and submit the nation to God's authority through amending the Constitution. This religious amendment for the Union was seen by promoters as a way to rectify this oversight of the Constitution and help them get back on the right side of God's favor to win the war. The alternative these Northern Protestants proposed was to add following the "we the people" in the preamble of the US Constitution to say, recognizing the being and attributes of Almighty God, the divine authority of the Holy Scriptures, the law of God as paramount rule, and Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior and Lord of all. Continuing on. Such an inclusion would, in the mind of religious amendment supporters, rectify this omission in the Constitution and then place the Union on a higher moral ground than the Confederacy. Amendment supporters thought the Confederacy perverted the messages of Jesus when they claimed the Bible supported the continuation of slavery. Additionally, amendment supporters thought that because Jesus was not in the Constitution, the Union was being punished through the Civil War. This was a punishment from God for not acknowledging him, and without properly rectifying it, the US could not win the war. There was very little formal action on the part of the US government with this amendment during the Civil War. According to reports, President Lincoln brought it up at a cabinet meeting, but nothing came of his mention. He didn't follow it any further. The amendment popped back up because of Covenanter support, bringing it to congressmen as potential bills for them to pass several times after the end of Reconstruction in the late 19th century and in the first decades of the 20th century. They then took a bit of a pause during the World Wars, but returned with renewed vigor after World War II ended in order to promote their amendment. So this is where I'm going to focus a lot of my attention today. Between the mid-1940s and the mid-1960s, a group of Covenanters organized a specific lobbying organization, the Christian Amendment Movement, also known as CAM, with the only goal to add Jesus Christ to the US Constitution. They used two main justifications in this era to convince members of Congress to introduce the amendment. One, as an anti-communist effort to help combat communism at home while projecting the right image abroad, and two, as a needed remedy against Supreme Court decisions in a period that began to open up to protect religious liberty claims of non-Protestants more than ever before. It did work, at least to some degree. We definitely don't have a Christian constitution in the US today, but senators and representatives introduced bills for amending the Constitution with CAM-specific language 50 times in 20 years. So those 11,000 attempts I mentioned earlier include 50 just in 2 decades on this amendment. Through my research, I found that CAM's view of separation provided an alternative understanding and reaction to pervading legal interpretations of the day. Though they failed, they show us the limits of this anti-communist rhetoric in the public sphere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about CAM as an organization and the arguments they used, and then I'll contrast them with their opposition as well as the Supreme Court cases that didn't fully support a Protestant Christian vision for the US. In 1945, a group of Covenanters known as Reformed Presbyterian, this particular denomination, founded the Christian Amendment movement. Though they were not specifically for Reformed Presbyterians only, the Christian Amendment movement's leaders were only ministers from the Reformed Presbyterian Church. Additionally, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America provided the majority of the lobbying organization's funding, indicating its importance. They were placed under the Reformed Presbyterian Witness Community, its missionary arm, making it part of their outreach to the world. The Christian Amendment movement was a group with the explicit and sole aim of adding an amendment to the US Constitution to recognize the authority of Jesus Christ. Earlier attempts, they had created lobbying organizations that worked on a variety of fronts, so this is a new concerted effort for them. And they wanted to impact the world. Events and fears in this era drove arguments for Christian amendments that differed from those in earlier periods. By the mid-1940s, the reality of world war was clear, including the implications of the nuclear age. That reality, combined with a newly emerged enemy, godless communist Russia, was enough to make CAM members believe that non-Christian nations, including the United States, were at risk. Their periodical, The Christian Patriot, included cover articles touting the ability of the Christian Amendment to persuade communists about the error of their ways. It's a fun example up there. Beginning in 1947, CAM leaders went to congressmen with a draft of an amendment. Here you can see a picture of it, but here's the text. It's a little easier to read. It began forcefully, quote, "This nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, Savior and ruler of nations, through whom are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God," end quote. This amendment definitely met the theological criteria of Reformed Presbyterians and other Covenanters. It reaffirmed all civil power is derived from God, particularly as incarnate through Jesus Christ. Reverend Sam Boyle was the editor of CAM's periodical, The Christian Patriot. He'd previously served as a missionary to South China until he was forced to leave due to the Communist Party's takeover. This positioned him well for this job. As a former missionary, he was accustomed to the need for travel for successful outreach. And to gain supporters for the movement in the 1940s through the 1960s, he traveled extensively from his home in Kansas. Boyle also ardently opposed communism. He reprinted anti-communist articles that he could get permission to include in the Christian Patriot. These articles from the US News and World Report and other major news organizations included tropes of Christianity and the United States fighting against the influence of atheistic communism in the world. The articles posed it as a battle between God and Satan. In this way, CAM's arguments mirrored many others of the day, as they directly quoted from other sources outside of their own movement. Boyle, in his editorial capacity, also engaged with broader arguments about US-Soviet relations, claiming that God was the only thing keeping the US from joining the Soviet Union in its communistic efforts. He printed subscriber letters that articulated their support of a Christian amendment because it would help combat communism. But Boyle suggested that readers also listen to their enemies' complaints as well. Kind of surprisingly, he used his experience as a missionary in Asia to urge subscribers to read what enemies wrote. Boyle read Lenin, Stalin, and Mao as a way to try to combat their influence. He spelled out his perspective plainly, quote, "This means that when we find our enemies pointing out the sins of our nation, we do not hide," end quote. He also warned that, quote, "Long before communism gained control of China, the secular forces in the national government passed a law that no Chinese school registered with the government could teach religion. Today in Red China, no schools that teach any religion are permitted to exist. Only a few phony seminaries are tolerated to maintain an outward show of religious freedom to tourists, but education in seminary halls is certainly controlled by the atheistic state." End quote. Boyle warned that any sort of exclusion of religion from public schools in the US could lead the nation down the same path towards atheistic communism. So a Christian amendment was needed to safeguard against these efforts. Camp's ardent opposition to communism found salience in the US as anti-communist efforts took over a broader social and political culture. For example, in this period, Senator McCarthy famously accused elites from around the country of communist sympathies, and few stepped up to challenge his assertions. There is a fun letter in the Truman archives where Truman drafts a letter telling McCarthy to basically chill out, but it's just a draft letter and he'd never sent it, so it's kind of interesting. Anyways, archive fun. While the fear was evident, there were different methods used to fight communistic influence and distinguish the US from communist USSR. But one way that many Americans used was through religion. This was because Karl Marx, considered the father of communist thought, famously wrote that religion was the opium of the people. Vladimir Lenin, chairman of the USSR, repeated this phrase and sentiment as well. This oft-repeated trope helped foster the perception that communistic threats were also a threat to religious identity and practice. As numerous historians of US religion, foreign policy, and the Cold War have noted, many Americans in political and religious leadership launched efforts to position the US as a God-fearing nation in contrast with the God-less USSR. Some of these actions included 1954, at the urging of the Catholic men's group, the Knights of Columbus, and the Protestant religious and other Protestant religious groups, Congress added "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God We Trust," which had been minted on coins for years, was added to stamps, paper money, and became the official motto of the US in the mid-1950s too. President Eisenhower famously claimed, quote, "Our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is," end quote. This God was clearly on the minds of many Americans, how they lived their lives, conducted their government, and posed themselves in opposition to communists around the world. Some senators and representatives agreed with the Christian Amendment movement in liking this Jesus Christ language, while others were less comfortable with the theological specificity of Jesus rather than a more generalized God. But they did find some support. Representative James B. Utt from California specifically cited the threat of communism as part of his impetus to support a Christian amendment. He claimed, quote, "If we are to survive the evil forces of communism, we must put Christ into a proper perspective in our national life. The Christian amendment is something that will help us make this a nation whose God is Lord," end quote. But in 1948, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Alexander Wiley, wrote to various government agencies to ask about potential repercussions to such an amendment. He did not receive positive news from the Assistant Attorney General's office, who told them that a Christian amendment would be problematic for Article 6 prohibition on religious tests for office that we looked at earlier, as well as problematic for naturalizing new citizens. So Wiley didn't recommend the 1948 proposed amendment to get out of committee and onto the floor for the Senate to vote. Jesus was just too specific. In a 1954 Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on the movement, this gave hopes to advocates that the amendment process would move forward. A committee hearing is something that often happens while they're considering whether or not to vote on it. Some speakers, like the Reverend William J. Coleman, were able to direct their remarks against communism specifically. Coleman stated, quote, "Our present secular program is not sufficient to meet the communist attack. We must bring to bear the whole weight of our Christian conceptions and traditions. These meet the communist conceptions head on," end quote. He further pleaded with the committee to see that the U.S. appeal against communism would be stronger if the U.S. posed itself as presenting, quote, "the splendid realities of a God-made, God-governed, and God-redeemed world, in contrast to a view which sees the world grinding on forever like a mill with no purpose, heart, mind, or will," end quote. The Pennsylvania branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union wrote to the hearing that among other reasons they supported the Christian Amendment, it would also help fight against communism. But rather than charge forward with their anti-communist agenda, CAM leaders instead, during most of the hearing, attempted to dispute the idea that the amendment was anti-Semitic. One of the men who supported the amendment claimed he couldn't be anti-Semitic because he preferred Jewish translations of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And another even went so far as to make the claim that he was great friends with Harry Houdini, so he couldn't be anti-Semitic. This did not convince the senator in charge of the hearing to move forward with the amendment, and again, it died at the end of the legislative session. So you might be thinking to yourself, of course there would be objections by different religious groups, and you're right, there were. Jews in particular in this era opposed Christian Amendment work publicly. Atheist organizations, emboldened by some court cases I'll mention shortly, also opposed the amendment as well. In earlier eras, other Sabbatarians, people who take Saturday as a Sabbath, particularly Seventh-day Baptists and Seventh-day Adventists, strongly opposed the amendment publicly for fear of the solidification of Sunday closing laws that existed piecemeal around the country. Two organizations in particular, the American Jewish Committee and the Synagogue Council of America, made inquiries in the 1940s to try to learn about these efforts as quickly as possible once the amendment started popping up in Congress. I had this excellent moment in the archives when I pulled folders from both the American Jewish Committee and the Synagogue Council of America and found the gold standard in archival research. Two sides of the conversation. Got both sides. It was amazing. The director of interfaith activities for the AJC, Arthur Rosenbaum, wrote that he discovered the Reformed Presbyterian Church backed the Christian Amendment movement, and Reformed Presbyterians were, quote, very small, with very little influence in ecclesiastical circles. Rosenbaum went on to state that it is a fundamentalist offshoot of the regular Presbyterian Church and is not large in either numbers or influence, end quote. The Synagogue Council of America also reached out to several other organizations, some with Jewish connections, to gather information and decide how to proceed. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith's national director helped the SCA develop their response. He recommended that they carefully consult other ecumenical organizations they were already in touch with, including the Federal Council of Churches and members of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, to understand their position. While the Anti-Defamation League leader hoped these Protestants and Catholics would come out against CAM, he cautioned the Synagogue Council from making large public statements about this underfunded, quote, propaganda program, as it may unwittingly win support for the movement, end quote. It seems for the most part, the Synagogue Council of America and the American Jewish Committee heeded this advice. They didn't publish widely on it in circulations to their members, but once the hearing was announced, representatives from these organizations showed up. For example, Rabbi Isidore Breslau argued that Christians should not need an amendment to coerce people to be Christian. He insisted all believers should have enough confidence in their religion to teach it to their families and propagate it, rather than need a mandate of Congress and the Constitution behind it. For Breslau, the amendment would make Jews and other non-Christians into second-class citizens. His argument forcefully claimed that every Jew would be discriminated against under this proposed amendment because Jews and adherents of other faiths would not be able to swear allegiance to every sentence of the Constitution. Putting it more personally, he suggested, quote, I do not want to owe my allegiance to only part of the Constitution. It is all mine, as much as it is all yours. Another question you might have is, how would this amendment even work? Isn't there a First Amendment with religious free exercise and non-establishment guarantees that you just talked about? Yes, there is. But because other citizens at the time asked this question, CAM leaders had a response. And they included two sections of their amendment to address these issues of religious liberty. Again, here's a picture of an actual bill, but there is the text itself. In section 2, they said, quote, This amendment shall not be interpreted so as to result in the establishment of any particular ecclesiastical organization or in the abridgment of the rights of religious freedom or freedom of speech, press, or of peaceful assemblage. Those are the other rights in the First Amendment. And then Section 3 gave Congress shall have the power in such cases as it may deem proper, provide a suitable oath or affirmation for citizens whose religious scruples prevent them from giving unqualified allegiance to the Constitution as herein amended. End quote. This second one troubled the Assistant Attorney General I mentioned earlier. There were options for alternative oaths and affirmations for citizens, but non-citizens who might want to become naturalized citizens wouldn't get those sorts of loopholes. And other detractors didn't find these sections sufficient. The Jewish representatives who showed up at the hearing that I mentioned earlier found them not comforting at all. Leo Pfeffer, the famous constitutional lawyer who worked at the time for the American Jewish Committee, argued that the power of Congress to give alternative oaths would put non-Christians at the whims of different Congresses who may or may not use that power well. Ultimately, these claims were of the second and third sections were not enough to give Congress a reason that a Christian amendment wouldn't upend religious liberty as they knew it. But this was the Christian Amendment movement's effort to state that it would not undermine First Amendment religious liberty. A month after the hearing, Congress voted to include the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance that I mentioned earlier. This edited pledge brought together lots of different Christian organizations, and President Eisenhower wrote the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic men's fraternal group that was instrumental in it, thanking them for their contribution to the effort to add God to the pledge. This Presbyterian president thought that the pledge would, quote, help us keep constantly in our minds and hearts the spiritual and moral principles which alone give dignity to man, upon which our life is founded, end quote. God was okay, but Jesus proved to be a road too far. In fact, U.S. courts were turning away from upholding Protestant Christian hegemony in many aspects of life to allow for greater forms of religious liberty. Let me share with you some of those developments. To start, in 1940 and 1947, the court expanded free exercise and Establishment Clause provisions of the Constitution's First Amendment to states. Previously, as I mentioned, they only applied to the federal government, but after incorporation, states also had to ensure free exercise and not establish a religion in the same way that the federal government had to. This led to much more frequency of Supreme Court cases on religious liberty than had been there in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The court decided cases in the 1940s and 50s that often upheld Protestant sensibilities about religious liberties to start. They didn't allow Sabbath keepers to violate Sunday closing laws and had other decisions in keeping with public peace and order that didn't always favor non-Protestants. But in 1948, the court decided in favor of an atheistic mother who objected to a released time religious instruction program at her son's school. They would leave classroom in order to get this instruction. This decision invoked ire among many CAM leaders and some members of Congress, but was only the beginning. By 1962, the court fully swung towards upholding the rights of religious minorities in ways that didn't always fit Protestant Christian sensibilities. In 1962, the Supreme Court declared that state officials could not compose prayer and encourage its recitation in public schools. The Engel case, the New York State Board of Regents wrote a prayer invoking the favor and protection of Almighty God, a prayer my father can recite to this day. Despite the attempt at writing a prayer that would be acceptable to those from a wide variety of religious backgrounds, the Supreme Court determined that this was an unconstitutional act. CAM representatives traveled to Washington to lobby members of Congress, arguing that a Christian amendment would help resolve the problems caused by this ruling. In 1963, in Abington Township versus Shemp, the court ruled that schools could not force students to read 10 verses of the Bible and recite the Lord's Prayer every morning. the court determined that states could not promote any particular religious exercises. Justice Tom Clark, who wrote the opinion, further stated that, quote, while the free exercise clause clearly prohibits the use of state action to deny the rights of free exercise to anyone, it has never meant that a majority could use the machinery of the state to practice its beliefs, end quote. He might need a bit of a history lesson, but he didn't leave room for a new conception of a Christian nation, even if demographics supported it. While these cases prompted major reactions from large swaths of the US population, they only reinvigorated Christian amendment efforts half-heartedly. CAM campaigned in their lobbying efforts to show that the amendment would fix these problems the Supreme Court made for Protestant Christians. A few members of Congress introduced some Christian amendment bills, but other legislators attempted to combat the school cases in different ways. Some senators and representatives introduced bills to protect prayer in school by a more targeted constitutional amendment that only dealt with that. People sent in thousands of letters from around the United States to their representatives and senators weighing in on this school prayer issue. Further research could help more precisely explain why that was the case if anyone's looking for a research topic. See, here's a bunch of boxes available in the US National Archives for your perusal on this particular issue. It is possible, and I think likely, that the Supreme Court decisions catalyzed those petitions. And in 1962, following the Engel case that prohibited the school board form of composed prayer, the number of proposed amendments allowing such prayers spiked. Another response some members of Congress proposed were amendments allowing Congress to override Supreme Court decisions. That would change the makeup of the Constitution, or amendments to make term limits for Supreme Court justices. Now that's something you have here, but that's not something that exists in the US. The House Judiciary Committee held an 18-day hearing on prayer in schools in the spring of 1964. 197 individuals testified in person, and then lots more sent in information later. These responses showed that citizens and legislators were interested in school prayer, but despite some overlap in the aims of the Christian Amendment, its main leader, Boyle, could not assume that Americans upset about the loss of school prayer would support the amendment. The prayers were already less theologically specific than what CAM used in its amendment. Their lobbying in these cases only received nominal support. A few legislators, as well as everyday Americans, wrote that they agreed with CAM that a Christian amendment was the appropriate reaction to the court's recent decisions. But others, like Senator Robert Kennedy, rejected CAM's logic. Quote, "It is my belief that the decisions at the Supreme Court, such as the school prayer decisions, are in keeping with the doctrine of separation of church and state as set down in the Constitution. This in no way takes God out of the lives of Americans. Americans have, and shall continue to have, the right of freedom of worship so long as liberty prevails." End quote. Ultimately, Kennedy articulated the vision that won the day. Religious liberty in the Constitution was more important to US citizens than adding Jesus Christ to the Constitution. The Christian Amendment movement found themselves on the outside of power. They were not supported by Congress or the courts, and ended up, after a few years of reorganization, disbanding by the end of 1975. The amendment attempts ended then, but their legacy lives on in Christian nation debates that we see with the Christian right, that push for candidates, policies, and made coalitions to advance their preference for Christian principles, rather than try to change the Constitution itself. More recent attempts to include Christianity in the public sphere tend to be targeted specific policies and practices, including the teaching of creation in addition to evolution in schools, supporting homeschooling, opposing gay marriage, and advocating for immigration reform. The Christian Amendment movement provides an insight into some of the efforts that didn't work in the fight against godless communism, but they did wage a campaign that showed the limits of theological specificity, using Jesus language publicly in a diverse nation with a godless constitution. Thanks.
If you do.
So thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. I'd love to ask you a question at the very beginning of the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, in a very abstract and ill-defined way, does mention both God and the Creator.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, the Declaration is serving a very different purpose than the Constitution, and Jefferson himself wasn't actually at the Constitutional Convention where it was written. But I'm curious. So it strikes me it wouldn't have been completely out of the question to mention God or something in the Constitution at that time. I'm curious, at that convention in Philadelphia, was there like a period of debate where they really considered whether or not to mention God in that preamble, and then made a deliberate decision not to, or was it just not part of the?
That's a great question. It was not really part of the discussion. There are some debates, particularly about the no religious test for office that happen because people are concerned that though a lot of people are comfortable with a variety of Christians holding office, many of the representatives there were uncomfortable with non-Christians holding office. So that received a lot of attention. There's a sort of odd discussion where, odd because it's out of character, discussion where Benjamin Franklin steps in at a particularly heated moment and says, why don't we invite a minister and have a prayer about this? But otherwise, not so much, no. It did come up a little bit in state ratification debates, but by that point, it was a little hard to do changes. Great question.
I'm really interested in the fact that they reached back to the Covenanters, back to the 17th century Scots. Did they have a fairly clear sense of what the Covenanters were up to, or is this just sort of our Presbyterian ancestors?
Some of them actually were the descendants of those people, so that's part of where they draw it from. They read a lot of those theologians. I'm pretty sure they were quite familiar with that. Just had a different idea of how it might work in America.
You said both the Covenanters and the Reformed Presbyterians were small. Were they geographically concentrated?
So Reformed Presbyterians have sort of two nodes of larger settlement. One is around Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania and Ohio a little bit, and the other is in Kansas. Other Covenanter, so Reformed Presbyterians are a type of Covenanter. There are other denominations that are part of the Covenanter movement in the U.S., including the Associate Reformed Presbyterians. They're a bit further south, but I don't remember quite where. I did less with them. But there's the concentration, at least of Reformed Presbyterians, is Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kansas.
Just as a follow-up, do they have any concentration in Alabama? I'm very interested in Roy Moore and the famous debacle of the Ten Commandments and so on.
Sure, yeah, no, but they did not have a stronghold in Alabama. Roy Moore is an interesting case, a judge in Alabama who had the Ten Commandments famously and refused to give them up. So they do have allies who might like their sorts of ideas about religion and government, but the main sort of backers were not from that area.
If we fast forward to the interesting times we live in today, isn't this something that the current president of the United States could curry favor with his base?
Sure, yeah.
And why haven't we heard more about that?
Well, I'm a historian, not a current political analyst, but the question is, this seems like something that could potentially be used by President Trump to curry favor among some people. And I think it could in some ways, but it is a pretty far outlier. Trying to change the American constitutional order to be explicitly Christian, even though a lot of policies may reflect that, is really hard. And the other thing I would say to that is that changing the Constitution itself is really hard. It's just not, 11,000 versus 27 that have been ratified, 26 that are in effect right now. So it's just, it may gesture certain things for him. It doesn't seem to me to be a great move politically because amending the Constitution is just so hard.
I have a question about the way that the Jewish groups decided not to publicize, like not to outright say this is a terrible idea that would draw attention to the issue. And related to that, I was wondering, you talked about the journal that this individual publicizing these conversations in. What did the other media, did they report on this at all? Was there stuff that you looked into that related to how that was reported?
Sure. So there were two questions. One about Jewish organizations and why they chose to not become really public about it, and the other one is about whether this appeared in other sorts of news media. First, the Jewish organizations, if we're thinking about this is post-World War II. The first one is 1946. It's a sort of tenuous time for American Judaism, though there definitely is more support for Jews in the US than in some other places in the world at the time. It still was a phase in which American Jews were a little uncomfortable being public about their advocacy for themselves in sort of the legal sphere. If you go back even earlier in the amendment attempts in the 1910s, for example, these organizations, not these particular ones, but other ones, just decided to do as little as possible because they did not want to make waves. So the fact that they even show up is kind of a new move for them and in a new public place as they are starting to feel more welcome in a public way. The other question about broader news media and if this was picked up, yes, it was. I tried to use only pictures I'm allowed to use, so part of it was trying to use those sources. But it definitely ended up in the New York Times and other major news organizations, as well as local papers when they would have events talking about it. In the 1910s, they had a lot of these huge World Christian Citizenship conferences, which they invited people from all over the world in order to talk about what it means to be a Christian citizen, usually related to whether or not your nation asserted itself as Christian from the get-go and how that was so much better than everyone else's countries. But those in particular received a lot of attention from the news media because they got big speakers to come as well.
A few more minutes if there's another question. No. All right. Well, let's thank Dr. Batlan again.